Good afternoon and good morning to everyone from coast to coast, and welcome to today's webinar, the 2016 State of Facilities in Higher Education, an in-depth look at the latest trends and best practices. Today's session will feature Peter Reeves, Associate Director of Member Services for Sightlines, and Pete Zara, Vice President of Market Strategy and Development for Sightlines. My name is not Pete. I am Eric Nolan, and I'm the Senior Marketing Manager at Sightlines, and I would like to thank you all for joining us today. I am very happy to say that we have a record-breaking audience with us today, and we're thrilled to be spending this time with each and every one of you. I will be moderating today's session as the Petes offer an exclusive look at the 2016 facilities trends in higher education and also explore key insights into the challenges and opportunities that face campus facilities managers and finance leaders. Now, before we get started, I'd like to call your attention to a very special offer that we have for everyone on the call today. As I'm sure a lot of you know and are familiar with, Sightlines produces an annual State of Facilities report, which over the years has become the definitive document for trends that affect campus facilities across North America. And this year's report is no different and is once again the catalyst for today's examination of those trends. With that in mind, we want you to be the first to know that the report is now available for download and can be found at the location on the screen, which looks like, is it on the screen? Excuse me. I want to make sure that everyone is still with us. It looks like we lost connection for a second there. Apologize. I'm not seeing the slide transition here. No audio. Okay. Can everybody, I see a lot of comments coming in that I think we lost connection. Looks like the network connection has been reestablished. So I hope everyone can hear me now. It looks like we are on the right slide at this point. So I'll go back a little bit. So just say before we get started, I do want to call your attention to this very special offer that we have for everyone on the call today. I'm sure a lot of you know and are familiar with, Sightlines produces an annual State of Facilities report, which over the years has become the definitive document for trends that affect campus facilities across North America. And this year's report is no different and is once again the catalyst for today's examination of those trends. So with that in mind, we want you to be the first to know that the report is now available for download and can be found at the location on the screen. But don't leave us just yet to go get it. We still have a lot of great information to share with you today, but absolutely don't forget to check that out as soon as you can. Now let's quickly review today's agenda. First is a quick introduction to Sightlines and our database of over 375 institutions with over 400 campuses across North America. Then Peter Reeves will lead us through a review of the 2016 State of Facilities trends, and at that point, we'll wrap everything up by reflecting on those trends and sharing some concluding thoughts on key strategies campuses are executing on that help to make the facilities problem smaller, to spur action on campus, new policies, and secure new funding. We'll also be setting aside some time at the end of the presentation to respond to any questions or comments that are submitted along the way. With that in mind, I'd like to remind you all that if you have any questions or comments during the presentation for either Pete, please don't hesitate to share those with us as you think of them. We'd like this to be an interactive session, and we very much look forward to answering any questions that come up along the way. I'll be monitoring them throughout the presentation, and as I mentioned before, we'll do our best to address each and every one of them towards the end of the presentation. To submit a question or comment, simply enter it in the questions box on your GoToWebinar window pane, and they will be sent directly to us. To answer one question up front that we typically receive, following today's session, each of you will receive an email that contains links to both the presentation slides and webinar recording for your continued engagement with this material. We'll also be sure to include some complimentary content that we think you might find valuable. So keep an eye out for that email tomorrow. Lastly, for anyone looking for more insight into strategies that have worked or to explore how institutions across the country are putting data into action to address some of their most prevalent challenges, the handout section on the GoToWebinar window pane will be the place for you. Handouts will give you instant access to complimentary resources such as previous webinar presentations, member success stories shared at industry conferences, and a speaker bio document if you'd like to learn more about our presenters today. So you can definitely check those out at any time during the session. And with that, I'll wrap up here. I'll pass it off to Pete Zara to get us started with some very brief background on Sightlines. So take it away, Pete.
Thanks, Eric. Hello, everybody. The one and only time you're going to hear about the company is briefly right here now at the beginning, just primarily to give you each some context for the information that Peter will be presenting. As many of you are aware, about a year ago, Sightlines joined the Gordian Company, which is an organization working to provide solutions throughout the facilities lifecycle. Sightlines' area of focus in particular is around planning and strategy, challenges facing institutions. And we're now part of an organization that brings the same commitment to delivering value throughout the life of a facility. At Sightlines, we provide services to address challenges and questions around space, capital, operations, and sustainability. We use qualified institutional data, working with the schools to benchmark, assess, and ultimately forecast and plan the future strategies for maintaining and enhancing campus facilities portfolios. Most importantly for this webinar, the source of information that forms the basis of this presentation is our database. It's drawn from information gathered from and with the partnership of the people at over 400 campuses across the United States and Canada. A database with more than 1.5 million square feet, serving 3 million students, which is about 15% of the U.S. higher education student population, or as Peter likes to say, nearly 1% of the U.S. population. The database is approximately 60% public and 40% private institutions and represents in almost equal parts comprehensive universities, research universities, and small institutions. So that's a brief overview of where we're coming from and what has shaped the information that is the basis for what you will now hear. And so with that, I turn the presentation over to Peter Reeves, who will take you through the 2016 State of Facilities in Higher Education Report.
Thanks, Pete. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the 2016 State of Facilities in Higher Ed. This is the annual webinar that Sightlines updates to highlight key facility-related trends across the country. What you'll see today, and as many of you know from working on your individual campuses, many of the trends that we see in higher ed are extremely challenging. Some of the key trends that we have highlighted here in 2016 is that we're seeing that deferred maintenance backlogs across the country continue to grow by all types of institutions and every type of cohort. What we've been able to do is identify really 3 main reasons for this growth in backlog. The first is that the eras of construction of facilities, in particular buildings that were built quickly and of a poor quality construction, have accumulated deferred maintenance at a fast pace. The second is that we've seen the majority of institutions underinvest in these spaces as they age, accelerating the growth of deferred maintenance. And finally, particularly over the last 15 years, we've seen a strong emphasis on building new space rather than investing those capital dollars into existing space, further compounding the problem. The last point that we want to highlight is that we've seen growing deferred maintenance at a time when enrollment growth at many campuses is flat to down, and the same can be said for facility-related operations. The key here for each individual institution is identifying where you stand in context to these broader trends and how that tells you and helps you predict what future challenges and future opportunities you have. We at Sightlines understand that the key to tackling the challenges faced by facilities officers in higher education require an understanding of the interrelationship between space, capital, and operations. That is to say, understanding how changes in one area, such as space, impact the demands for capital or the operation of that space. Sightlines aims to sit at the intersection of these 3 areas and help institutions make better decisions about all of them. The way in which we do this is by collecting vast amounts of data that falls into each one of these buckets. Within our space database, we're tracking assets, building assets with a replacement value of almost $300 billion. On an annual basis, we're tracking capital budgets of about $4 billion. And operationally, we see about $5.5 billion in annual operating costs within our database. These are substantial resources in each one of these areas, and thus all the more important for effective management of those. What we'll look at is trends in each one of these 3 buckets and understand and identify how they impact the other areas. It's hard to analyze facilities in higher education without first understanding the relationship between space growth and enrollment growth. What we're looking at here is the national average for space and enrollment growth from 2007. What we see is the tale of 2 time frames. Leading up to 2011, enrollment growth far outpaced space growth. This was really a result of having a few tailwinds to enrollment growth at college and universities. The first being high school graduates were increasing during this time frame. And the second was a large population of people choosing to go back to school or stay in school longer in response to the great financial recession. Given that enrollment was outpacing space growth, many institutions chose during the 2011-2012 timeframe to increase their campus, add space to meet the growing enrollment. And what we've seen in 13, 14, and 15 is that much of the space that was decided to be built in 2011-12 has come online during this time frame. What has changed, though, is from 2012 forward, enrollment growth has actually leveled out and even nationwide begun to decline in 14 and 15. As a result, institutions have more space per student in 2015 than they had in 2007. Now, this trend is not necessarily true for all types of institutions. When we look at and break that down by public institutions versus private, you can see the stories begin to change a little bit. On the public institution side, we actually see that the enrollment trends were much more exaggerated from the previous chart. Public institutions saw a much larger growth in enrollment leading into 2011, but have subsequently seen a much larger decrease in enrollment given that time frame. All the while, public institutions have continued to add space. Private institutions, on the other hand, have really matched enrollment and space growth at a similar pace during this time frame. One of the explanations for being able to maintain this enrollment growth at the private institutions is really their ability to discount tuition at a little bit of a higher level than public institutions, and as a result being able to maintain enrollment levels or even grow them, whereas public institutions did not have that ability quite as much. Even more interesting is to look at how the space and enrollment trends have changed for different institutions in the Carnegie classes. Here we'll start by looking at the comprehensive institutions, and what we can see is that, again, into 2011, enrollment growth of about 8% matched up well with space growth. So these institutions were kind of growing at a similar pace, both enrollment and space. Since that time, comprehensives have continued to add space while their enrollment has really leveled off. Similarly, small institutions had that growth into 2011, but their enrollment trend has really reversed course and begun to decline fairly precipitously and is now at a level that's below the 2007 enrollment levels. Many of these types of institutions are targeting strategies of building space as a tool to attract and retain students. What we can see, though, from the data thus far is that this strategy has yet to pay off, as both institutions have not seen meaningful increases in their overall enrollment. And as we'll show later in the presentation, this is a very costly approach as the maintenance and future capital costs of that new space are significant. Research institutions, on the other hand, have been the only outlier in this group with significant enrollment growth during this time frame, almost 14%, far outpacing the space growth. One of the explanations for enrollment outpacing the space is that many of the research institutions are larger institutions that have much of the facilities that they need and now are attracting more students to those facilities. The main takeaway from this slide is that on the comprehensive institutions and the small institutions, they currently have much more space per student than they had just 4 years ago. And what's important is understanding the density of campus, or how many users per 100,000 square feet institutions have, because this really tells you a lot about how well utilized space is. What we're looking at here is our database distribution for density factor, which is the metric that measures this use of space for our entire database. What you can see is the majority of institutions, the average institution falls at about 330 on this, with liberal arts, smaller, wealthier institutions falling on the left-hand side. And then as you get to more urban, commuter, community college, those are going to fall on the right-hand side. What is interesting to look at is how private and public institutions average vary here. Private institutions tend to be lower than the average campus we work with on this density factor, meaning they have more space per student. And this in many respects is due to the fact that they have, in many cases, the wealth capacity to maintain larger campus footprints relative to their student body. Whereas on the public side, they need to be higher in terms of density, more efficient users of space because they're more tuition dependent. One of the key takeaways is that when we look at this metric density factor for our entire database, we've seen this density factor metric decrease 5% over the last 5 years. Said another way, institutions are becoming less crowded than they once were over the last 5 years due to this fact that they've been building space while enrollment has leveled out. All the while this is happening while classroom utilization is in a 50 to 60% range. This tells us one of two things. It's either that institutions have more space than they need, or institutions don't have the right type of space that they need. And we'll talk a little bit more about what's driving some of this density on the next few slides. As important as density is, it's also important to understand how the eras of construction of buildings impact the costs associated with maintaining and investing in those buildings long term. What we're looking at here is what we call the waves of construction. This looks at when space was built across higher education in 5-year buckets over the last 125 years. What you can see in the blue is that there's been 2 major waves of construction over this time frame. The first from 1950 to 1980, which is what we call the post-war boom of construction, was a response to a large number of students entering college campuses nationwide due to the GI Bill and generally due to positive demographic trends, boomers all coming of college age during this time. What we saw was institutions responded by building a substantial amount of space and building it in a short period of time. One of the side effects of this was that much of that space was of poor quality construction, and what we're seeing as those buildings age, they age far less gracefully. At the same time, we've seen a more recent wave of construction, a boom of construction in the last 15 years. And what this really is institutions responding to the new demands of the college campus. This has been a wave of 2 major types of spaces. The first being student life and student amenities, so residence halls, recreation centers, and much of that focused at improving student experience, and as we talked about previously, in recruiting and retaining students that you have. The second group of buildings that has been built during this time frame is much of the high-tech science research space. You can't do 21st century science in 20th century buildings, and that's really what we're seeing. Institutions had to build new facilities to meet those demands. What's particularly challenging about this setup is that that first wave of construction, all of those buildings are reaching the end of their useful life, sometime either now or in the next 10 years. While that second wave of construction, those buildings built from 2000 forward, are reaching their first round of major life cycle replacements, again, over this next 10 to 15 year period. So you're going to have competing needs between newer, more complex buildings for keeping up with them, investing in them, while at the same time you're going to have a substantial demand from those older buildings for catching up or reinvesting in those buildings to bring them up to the current standard. All the while this is happening, as we will show in the future, while capital budgets are flat to down. So that the capital demands are increasing, the capital to invest in those spaces is decreasing. One way that institutions have managed this is through major renovations. And so what you can see here is how this waves of construction change when you account for major renovations. To see this trend of renovation more clearly, what we can look at is comparing the construction age of space, which is on the left-hand side, to the renovation age of space on the right-hand side. What we do is break it into 4 buckets: under 10, 10 to 25, 25 to 50 and over 50, youngest on the bottom, oldest on the top. What I really like to highlight is space under and over 25 as the dividing line between young and old space. So what you can see from a construction standpoint is that almost 70% of space is over 25 or in that older category. Whereas when we look at renovation age, you can see that institutions have renovated space to the extent that they've created almost a balanced age profile with only 55% of space over 25 in the gray and the orange and 45% under 25. Particularly interesting as you look into the different categories more closely is that the majority of renovations have occurred in buildings over 50. And so many of these are those pre-war flagship buildings on your campus. These are the ones on your key quads. These are probably where many of the presidents sit. These are the types of buildings that will be on your campus forever. Where we haven't seen much in terms of renovation is in that grouping of the 25 to 50-year-old buildings, that gray section, with only about 1% being renovated during this time frame. What we view this as is that these are many of those post-war buildings, that major spike of construction we saw in the previous chart. Many of these being lower quality buildings that aren't meeting the programmatic demands of campus now. These were really buildings that campuses are waiting to see. Because of the challenge with these, many institutions are evaluating, are these long-term assets for our campus, or are these some that we want to actually phase off our campus and maybe replace with newer facilities that can more effectively meet the programmatic need. As we just talked about on the previous slide, though, these are going to be the key decision buildings for each campus because many of those are reaching the end of their useful life here in the near future. To look at this trend between the different categories, national, public, and private, what you can see is that generally speaking, there has been an increase in the space under 25 in all three of these categories, whether that be through renovation or new construction. But by and large, there hasn't been a meaningful shift in the age profiles across the country. So as we mentioned, the capital needs of space are increasing due to the construction errors of that space as well as the renovations that have or have not occurred to those spaces. So next we want to look at and understand what are the capital resources that institutions have had to address these building-related needs. What we're looking at here is total capital investment into existing space on $1 per square foot for the national average. So this really looks at what institutions are spending not on new construction, but rather are spending into their existing square footage. What we see is overall, the average investment has been about $5 per square foot over this 9-year time frame. And that can be a pretty good benchmark for you to use at your individual institution to compare to the national average and communicate where you stand versus the national database. What you can see is there have been some fluctuations around this level. 2008, 2009 were higher in response to the financial recession. We saw a pullback in capital investment, which is what we're observing in 2010, 2011. In the last few years, there's been a lot more volatility in terms of investment levels, 2014 being down, 2015 being up. But generally speaking, it all kind of hovers around that $5 a square foot. Where there have been changes is in how projects are being funded. At Sightlines, we make a distinction between what we call annual capital, or those funding sources that are budgeted for by the institution and are directed by facilities, versus one-time sources of funding that are large, more project-specific funding sources that tend to be greater in dollar amounts, but tend to be much more volatile. These might be major renovations, grants, gifts, bonds, things like that. They don't come along all the time, but when they do, they tend to be large infusions of capital. What we've seen is that in the last 5 years, institutions have been allocating a greater level of investment in annual capital. That is to say that institutions understanding that they're not going to be able to grow their overall investment levels have been setting aside a greater portion locally for investment into space over that time frame to address needs as they come due. What we find is that investments made in annual capital yield about a 1-to-3 ratio in terms of impact than those invested into one time. Said a different way, $1 spent proactively in annual capital tends to equate down the line to $3 to $4 in one-time capital. When we break this down by public versus private, what we can see is that the trends begin to change a little bit. In general, private institutions have been investing at a higher level than public, about $5.25 a square foot, compared to public institutions at about $4.75. However, private institutions have been hit much harder by the financial recession and in fact have not recovered to their prior investment levels in 2008 and 2009. Public institutions were the beneficiaries in 2010, 11, 12 of stimulus funding, of state allocation as a way to have an economic impact within their state. And so the public institutions did not see that immediate decrease, but now in the subsequent years, 2013, 14, 15, we're beginning to see the investment level decline a bit. And what will be interesting to monitor is does this decline continue into the future? when we break this down by the 3 Carnegie classes, on average, there isn't a whole lot of difference in terms of the overall investment level. Again, hovering right around that $5 a square foot. Where there is a difference, and sort of interestingly enough, is in the last 3 years. Looking at comprehensive institutions, we've begun to see a decline in overall investment in the last 3 years. At the same time, small institutions, not necessarily a full decline, but much more volatility in investment levels in the last 3 years. And much of this is likely tied to the enrollment trends that we highlighted before, that these campuses have seen declining enrollments, and often their capital investment can be tied to those enrollment trends. Research institutions, on the other hand, have seen substantial increases in overall capital investment. In the last couple of years have been the highest levels of investment on record for those institutions within our database. This really highlights the positive position that they're in with growing enrollments, not growing spaces fast, and really investing into existing square footage. Overall, though, what we've highlighted is that institutions are facing growing capital demands due to the eras of construction and the age of their space at a time when investment levels have been more or less flat over the last 9 years. As a result, we've seen backlogs across the nation grow from about $80 a square foot to almost just over $100 a square foot in 2015. So this represents almost a 25% growth from 2007. More importantly, as we work with facilities professionals across the country, one thing that we hear is that $100 a square foot is a pretty meaningful threshold for backlog, in the sense that as campuses start to push past that $100 a square foot, reactive maintenance becomes much more costly and much more frequent. And so you begin to see a spillover of capital needs coming into operating budgets. The further you push away from $100 a square foot, the more acute that pain becomes. Looking at this between public and private institutions, as you might expect, given the fact that private institutions have invested at a higher level, we see that public institutions have been growing faster and at a higher level, overall level, over this time frame. And public institutions are almost at $110 a square foot, whereas private institutions are closer to $80 or $85 a square foot. What's interesting is that excluding the first 3 or 4 years, both public and private institutions have had backlog trends that are similar in terms of the speed with which they're growing. And this really speaks to the fact that, in the last 3 to 5 years, we've seen similar investment levels and similar challenges for both public and private institutions from a capital perspective. As I mentioned, with growing backlogs, aging campus, lower capital investment, the fear is that this will begin to spill over and impact day-to-day operations. So shifting gears and looking at the operations profile, first looking at the resources that institutions have to manage their facilities operations. What we're looking at is facilities operating budgets on a dollar per square foot basis for daily service and planned and preventative maintenance of campus. Daily service looks at the salary, wages, benefits, materials and contracts it takes for campuses to operate their campus. And planned and preventive maintenance, the red section here, is those dollars going towards proactive value-add work. For the sake of this chart, we have excluded the utilities component, but understand that that's an important factor in driving operating costs as well. What we want to highlight here is that from 2008 to 2011, we actually have seen pretty much flat facility operating budgets across the country. And so certainly as campuses have aged, as backlogs have grown, as capital has been underinvested in, this certainly puts an additional challenge in the fact that institutions don't have additional resources to account for those challenges. In the last 3 years, we've begun to see a restoring of those daily service budgets to some extent, and we're really looking at 2 drivers of this. The first, a bit of a positive one, in that institutions have started to loosen the purse strings in terms of allocating a little bit more towards increasing personnel costs, things of that nature. The other driver could be, and we have observed at some campuses, that it's the fact that the underinvestment in capital and the growing backlog has begun to spill over to the extent that contracted services costs, maintenance materials are starting to go up, and there's not much that institutions are able to do to minimize that increase. On a positive note, what we are seeing is that the planned preventative maintenance component, that red section, has grown pretty substantially from 2007 to 2015, almost 50%. However, the absolute level of planned preventative maintenance still remains very low. This is one area, the growth being a positive and being an acknowledgement by many campuses that this is one way operationally to minimize the lower capital resources in a sense, because it is allowing campuses to push life cycles further out into the future, thus lowering the capital burden. However, the absolute level of that still leaves a lot of room for continued improvement. To look at this broken down between public and private institutions, what we can see is actually in 2015, both public and private institutions are fairly close in terms of overall operating costs. Public institutions are about $5 a square foot. Private institutions are just slightly over $5 a square foot. So again, going back to that idea of $5 a square foot for facility operating costs, excluding utilities, is a good benchmark, whether you're a public institution or a private institution, to sort of understand where your budget lands relative to the national database. What we have seen, given the low level of facility operating budget growth, is that institutions have had to make challenging decisions on how to become more efficient with their operations. And in a few areas, particularly on the staffing side, this is where we've seen this show up. First, we're looking at the custodial coverage levels. So this is the amount of square feet per custodian, per custodial FTE, essentially how much space each custodian is covering. And what we see is that if you look at the national average on the left, is that this custodial coverage ratio has gone from about 32,000 in 2007, 2008 to almost 35,000 in 2014. So this was to say that each custodian was being asked to cover more and more space. So what we've seen in 2015 is a decline in the custodial coverage ratio. This means that institutions are adding custodial positions rather than removing them. And our conversations with campuses is really leading us to the fact that institutions have reached a tipping point where they are not willing to sacrifice service levels any further, and in fact in many cases are looking to add positions to improve the custodial service levels, the cleanliness levels of campus. It's too early to tell if this trend will continue, but at least in the short term this seems to be a bit of a threshold that institutions are willing to get to. At the same time, we've seen a similar trend, but not to the same extent in terms of absolute level, in the maintenance side, where maintenance coverage ratios have gone from the low 80s nationwide to the high 80s nationwide. And you can see that this is really just a reduction in overall maintenance staffing levels across the country. Part of this has been done through early retirements or not filling positions that have come open, freezing positions. The other challenge that many institutions we're working with are facing is actually finding people to fill these positions and finding the right people to fill these positions. One of the challenges too is that institutions with the new space that they're adding need a different type of maintenance worker than they needed in the past. And so there's an opportunity at many of these campuses to transition from more of a general or structural trades worker to more of a specialized mechanical, electrical, controls-based maintenance worker. And we see an opportunity as waves of retirements that are likely due to come in the next 5 or 10 years happen to maybe think about not necessarily replacing those positions with the same position, but rather replacing it with one of these more technical focused positions. While we didn't look at the costs of energy with regards to the day-to-day operating budget, what we did want to look at is the energy consumption trends that we've seen across the country. What we're looking at here is BTUs per square foot, and it's broken down between fossil in the blue and electric in the red. What we've seen is a really positive trend in that institutions have reduced their energy consumption by about 8% over this 9-year time frame. Much of this reduction has come as a result of institutions looking at energy as a way to not only reduce an annual cost, paying the energy bill, but also as an opportunity to address some deferred maintenance on campus. So institutions have created revolving green funds, have looked at ESCOs, and even just locally targeted some of these projects that serve the dual purpose of reducing energy consumption, addressing deferred maintenance, and likely providing some benefit on the operations side as you're addressing an aging mechanical system. As we have conversations across the country, though, we're hearing that a lot of the low-hanging fruit has been addressed, and so to continue this trend moving forward will require looking at more costly projects up front or those types of projects that have a longer payback. In looking at unit costs, what we've seen is from 2008 and 2009 to now, we've seen a pretty substantial decline in the overall unit cost realized in our database, both for electric and fossil. The big driver of this is that the cost of natural gas has declined substantially, as everybody on the call knows. And what we've seen is many institutions that previously weren't using natural gas are now using natural gas, have fuel switched to natural gas in their main utility plants, and as a result have realized fairly substantial cost avoidance, cost savings on the utility side. However, that's a one-time cost savings that they would realize, and it's unlikely to see those types of cost reductions due to unit costs going forward. And in fact, if the cost of natural gas were to begin to increase, you would start to see some of that cost savings go away. Finally, we want to summarize some of the trends that we saw today and then focus on some of the strategies of the institutions that we work with and how they're combating some of these challenging trends. What we see is that one of the primary drivers of these challenges is the fact that we had this large post-war boom of construction across higher education. Many of these buildings were built to a lower quality construction standard, and all of these buildings are reaching the end of their useful life between now and sometime in the next 10 to 15 years. This is happening at a time when institutions have focused their investment into new facilities to meet the growing demands of space, such as student life space, science research space, while underinvesting in existing square footage. What we're going to have is a situation over the next 10 to 15 years where the demand for catching up in that older space, those post-war buildings, is competing with keeping up in the younger space. Again, all of this happening at a time when capital resources have been flat to down, resulting in the overall backlogs that we realize across campuses growing, and growing at a fairly substantial rate, about 25% over the last 9 years. Aging campus, growing backlog is challenging enough, but what we've seen is that operating resources have not been increased at the level necessary to compete with these challenges, and as a result, we have seen service levels being reduced. In the last few years, we have seen some budgets being restored. We have seen some staffing levels beginning to be filled and grown. And so it's interesting for us to monitor, is this the beginning of a trend of increasing investment, or is it just a blip in the overall trend that we're seeing? And finally, we have seen some improvement on the energy side. And in particular, when you look at the decrease in consumption and the decrease in unit cost, the overall expenditures on utilities have gone down during this time frame. And so that's provided a bit of a relief for some of the strained resources that we've seen. As we mentioned, though, the question here is, can that trend of decrease continue, or have we reached a level where it's likely to stay for the near term? With these trends that we're talking about, certainly, they're challenging, but there are ways that institutions are addressing these challenges. The first is the idea is you're not going to be able to address everything, but how do you manage the risk of what you have? So the first and sort of the easiest to talk about, maybe one of the harder ones to do, is to lower your capital and operational demands, and kind of the quickest way to do this is to look at identifying space that you can remove on your campus. We've seen institutions focus on the utilization of their space and potentially trying to increase utilization. By doing so, being able to eliminate buildings, particularly those buildings that are high cost to operate, that are in poor condition, likely aren't meeting the programmatic needs of your campus. This has the effect of creating a balanced age profile, to lower your capital demands and to lower your operational demands. Another piece, which I'll mention a little more detail on the next slide, is trying to make the problem smaller for decision makers. It's hard to say we have all of these needs and they all are the same priority, and so we'll talk a little bit about how institutions are prioritizing and communicating the priority of capital investments. A big piece here is how do you make sure that whatever capital you have has the greatest impact possible. So this is really looking at ways to invest on an annual basis and to track and address high reliability, critical building needs, making sure that the things that could potentially shut a building down are addressed. And then also being able to identify when an investment yields some operational efficiency or operational savings. The final one is this idea that with challenges and demands of space growing and operating budgets not growing at the same speed, how do you manage your resources and how do you communicate the standards or communicate the service levels that can be delivered given the resources you have? And it's really important to be able to do that and have some tools to be able to do that. As I mentioned on the previous slide, what we've found is the sort of approach of making the problem as big as possible, assuming you're only going to get a portion of what you ask for, and if you make the problem bigger, you'll get a bigger portion. We don't really see that that has been an effective strategy for many campuses, and what we advocate for is this idea of breaking down the needs you have into more bite-sized chunks. So what we'll often advocate for is segmenting your campus into different groupings of buildings or projects with similar strategies. So one example might be creating a transitional portfolio, buildings that you will choose not to invest in until a long-term plan has been determined for them. You may have some programmatically and strategically important buildings. These are ones that even if they're in good shape, you want to continue to focus some investment in because they're core to the mission of your university. And finally, you may want to group some buildings into good condition buildings that you want to keep in good condition, because those are some that can be long-lasting great assets for your campus. And so these are some of the ways in which institutions are taking the large total campus backlog, breaking it down into more bite-sized chunks so that the institutional leadership can make effective decisions. And having the data and having the metrics to communicate these needs can be really key in success with senior administration and senior decision makers. So with that, I'll hand it back over to Eric for the live Q&A, and appreciate all the time you guys have given us today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Pete. That was excellent. Well, that wraps up the content of today's session. So let's get right into the questions because we have a ton of them at this point. The first one that we'll bring up is considering their situation, what should small campuses do to reduce risk at this point?
Yeah, I guess this is Peter Reeves. I'll start on that one. One of the most important things when it comes to institutions like small institutions that are in such a challenging position, one of the main things that we recommend is really thinking deeply and being very strategic about the space that you have, and really think a lot about any additional space you're thinking about bringing online. In many cases, these institutions may need to bring on new space to stay competitive, but given the financial situation, oftentimes we'd advocate for identifying some space that you could also take offline, something that amounts to a no net new space type policy, so that you're not adding additional burden of net new space. So just, I think overall being very strategic about the space that you have, how well utilized it is, and really asking the question about, is it worth adding additional space that has the costs associated with it?
Okay, thanks, Pete. The next one is, do you have any thoughts about organizational challenges that prevent schools from taking on these issues that you guys highlighted today?
This is a pretty big question, and maybe Pete will also, Pete Surratt would want to offer his insight, but I think one of the biggest ones that we run into is just it gets down to the space and who's responsible for the space, and that distinction between departments and facilities. I think that often can slow the progress against some of these challenges, as there's a lot of discussion about who's responsible for it, who should be funding it, and certainly I think that that's one organizational setup that can be a challenge.
Yeah, this is Pete. I would say the other thing that comes to mind is that sometimes organizationally the leadership and decision making on acting is separated and siloed. So the people thinking about planning are separate from the people who are operating, or separate from the capital. And so anything that can be done to bridge those relationships and get people to be thinking about space and capital and operations in a shared set of discussions, in shared forums, is pretty critical to the ability of the organization to confront the challenges and then be able to come to consensus on the choices that they're going to make. And it's probably also fair to say that all of that assumes that the institution has placed these conversations it's central to the decision-making of the institution. These facilities questions cannot be peripheral to the operation of the institution. They're pretty critical to the success of meeting the mission. And first and foremost, everybody has to recognize that within the institution.
Okay, thanks guys. The next question is, you showcased several services at the beginning. What is the service by which you get this particular data? Is it all of them, or is there one in particular? What were we really focusing on?
Yeah, the majority of the data that we looked at today comes from our facility benchmarking and analysis service, what we call ROPA, Return on Physical Assets. And that's where the majority of the data that populated these trends comes from, and one of our keys is that we work hard and diligently in that service to make sure that the data is collected and processed consistently across institutions, so that we are confident that we have an apples to apples, and that really allows us to have good faith in the benchmarks that we're showing here.
Okay, thanks Pete. The next question is, can you comment about schools that have decided to remove buildings? How has that been politically? Is it a challenge? It seems like you make some of those recommendations. How does that go with the institutions that you work with?
It's a very good question, and I think it's often a very difficult decision, and there's a lot of politics around the decision to remove space that you already have, as well as the people who are currently occupying that space. So we definitely see the challenges there, but we are also seeing institutions that are really beginning to reap the benefits in terms of being able to direct the resources that otherwise would have to go to some of these spaces elsewhere, and really beginning to see the impact of that. And that helps reinforce how removal of space can be a positive strategy in the medium term.
This is Pete. It is fair to say that for a long time on college and university campuses, space was sacred and locally sacred, and that's the political challenge that Peter's talking about, and what these data are telling us is that we're going to have to confront the notion that every place is sacred, and the places that are most successful have decided that certain places are sacred, certain places are special, and define the character of the institution, but many other spaces, it turns out, are not. But it just takes a very frank and candid conversation about that.
Okay, thanks guys. Next question, have you noted any impacts from the growing price of construction contracting, which appears to be moving ahead of general inflation?
Yeah, so construction pricing has for decades run ahead of general inflation. The causes from that are varied and often regional, but broadly, the fact that more regulation and more complexity has been introduced into the construction process, more care in the way things are built, more sophistication in the buildings means that it's not trending in the same way that the rest of the marketplace is, where oftentimes efficiency or productivity is reducing the cost that's associated with procuring anything from a product to a service. So I think that trend has been running for a long time. In many parts of the country, that trend has gotten much more steep in the last 3 to 5 years post the deep years of the recession, as contractors have been recovering from the downturn, recovering costs, rebuilding themselves, rebuilding their organizations, reestablishing. And so some of those costs are really out of our controls as buyers and as owners. They're just the nature of the business. But to the point of the question, the impacts are severe. One, in some cases, it slows down the ability of the institution to make the investments. In other cases, it's forcing decision-making that can be productive if it squeezes out the soft parts of projects, but it does run the risk of removing some value in the projects as a way to make budgets work. And if not carefully done, we can be making these ever more complicated buildings more difficult to manage and operate down the line. So it's forcing institutions to make difficult choices between the scale of the project or what are sometimes unfairly called amenities. It's forcing a very important conversation that, again, is it's critical to have the planning team, the building team, and the operating team all together in that conversation to make the right choices.
Okay, thanks, Pete. Here's a quick one. Have you or do you work with K-12 schools as well as higher ed?
This is Pete. We believe that we do some work that is effective in a lot of K-12s. We do work with some private institutions, private schools, where their configurations and arrangements are very similar to small liberal arts colleges, and we have had some conversations with K-12 organizations, but I would not say the database is comprised of very many K-12 schools, no.
Okay, thanks, Pete. Next one, are you seeing differences in the data between academic spaces and student living spaces in terms of budget investment?
Yeah, so I think that there's, and I'm assuming, or I'm making an assumption that the question's asking about facility operating budgets with that space, so the cost to operate academic versus student life. And we do see a bit of a difference, and we really see a difference in the level of service expected in those two types of space. A lot of times the student space has some food services, things like that, and so that there's a higher demand for sort of a higher service level in those spaces, and there are for some of the traditional classrooms. And then the other piece that we see on much of the student life space is, given the higher traffic and higher use in a lot of those, that they just require a higher level of ongoing costs going into it to just keep those up and invest in them over the life of those buildings. So yeah, I think hopefully that answers that question.
Okay, thanks, Pete. The next question is, with the complex spaces that are being built now, how much have construction costs increased over the past several decades?
I don't.
It would be, yeah. I wouldn't necessarily want to give an answer here without looking into that more closely. It also has a lot to do with, all spaces, no matter the function of the buildings, have become more complex in the last 10 to 15 years. But certainly construction costs for science research type space may have gone up at a different pace from that of just more complex traditional academic space. So that's a difficult question to answer, I think.
Yeah, I would say that I've seen construction trends running at, on average over the last 20 years, about 3 to 4% a year. depending on where you are. In some places, much steeper. There are parts of the country right now where we are seeing construction pricing increasing at 6, 7, 8% in the short term, and that's changing the annual, overall annual. But I would say you could assume a 3 to 4% increase per year over the last couple decades.
Okay, thanks guys. It looks like one of the last questions here that we have so far. Scheduling space is a real issue for our campus, and until we have an adequate system to be able to do this university-wide, it makes it very difficult to assess our spatial resources. Anything that we can do in the meantime with this issue?
Yeah, it's a really great question, a really difficult issue around space utilization is understanding how that space is scheduled and who has control of scheduling the space. What we found in doing space assessments, space utilizations, is that the more people that can schedule a space, the more utilized that space is, which I think in many respects is obvious, but it is one of those pieces where when you have departmentally controlled spaces that the registrar doesn't even know about that are being scheduled just for a few classes, there's a huge opportunity there. And so one of the things that we would really probably make the case for is, one, understanding all of the possible spaces that you have to schedule, and then understanding who has scheduling capability in those spaces, and try and make as many spaces available to a sort of central scheduler as possible.
Yeah, and we certainly have seen examples, just specifically in the academic realm, where people are being very, very creative in their spaces. They're designing so that a lab can be used at different time of day for teaching a humanities course. Those kinds of decisions are being made in new projects in different places. But I think it's also fair to say it's not just an academic issue. Athletic space can be used in different ways. When it's not being used for competition, there may be other people who can use it. Libraries certainly are an example of spaces on our campuses which are seeing lots of discussion around how to think about them differently, and I think, Peter, you're right that the more people who can be engaged with the space and can get access to the space, the more creative ways people can find to use it, and that's going to radically improve utilization. Students in particular are creative about how they can take advantage of the space. They just need space to meet and gather sometimes, and if we can create the opportunity for them to do that, that we don't need to build entirely new spaces for them.
Okay, thanks guys. It looks like that may be it for now, but we have a few more minutes, so if anybody has any additional questions, please feel free to continue submitting those now. While we wait for more questions to trickle in, I'd like to let you all know that you will be receiving a post-webinar survey at the conclusion of today's session. It's a quick 5-question survey that should probably only take about a minute or two to complete, and it's really designed to not only get your thoughts on the content of today's presentation, but to also get a sense for the challenges that you face on campus, and with those in mind, what topics you'd like to hear from us, hear from Sightlines at future events. So we'd really love to hear from all of you. It looks like we've got one more coming in. What challenges are you forecasting from the recent election? Yeah, it looks like it may have been repeated twice. Yeah, what challenges are you forecasting from the recent election, if any?
Wow.
I was going to say, are we allowed to avoid that question? It seems like no. Pete, do you?
I think it's fair to say that we don't know from day to day or week to week where we're headed following the election. I think maybe the biggest challenge is just that. It's the lack of predictability for some organizations. I think that one of the keys, certainly in our public sector programs, is a kind of clarity about where we're going and where we're headed, because the time frame for planning, whether it's tied to construction, renovation, or other kinds of things, is relatively long, and I anticipate we're going to have some stutter steps in people's action until they can get a sense of where the election is taking us. And I would say that's not just at the federal level, but certainly at the local level too. This was not just about a change at the president's office. It was certainly a change across a lot of the country, and so it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out. But I think that's the biggest challenge right now, is just a lack of clarity that's going to lead to hesitation on the part of institutions and their ability to act, which just builds further on this issue that Peter's talk started with, which is the ever-increasing deferral problem that we're facing in the backlog that as owners and operators we struggle to address. So that would be my reaction to that.
Okay, very interesting. All right, so I actually have one more question that just came in. What are the trends, if you can't answer, what are the trends in breakdown of maintenance backlog for utility plants, assets, and housing facilities as opposed to academic facilities? Have we seen utility plants follow similar trends in weaker historical campus construction or investment?
That's an interesting question. I'm sort of trying to think through in my experience on that one. You know, I know that we see at many of the campuses we work with either a need for reinvestment in the utility infrastructure, or for some campuses a recent reinvestment in it. So that would say that institutions are seeing the capital demands of that space. I don't know that it's necessarily driven by the quality of those utility plants when they're built, but yeah. Pete, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm thinking similarly about some of my experiences. I would say that in some respects it depends on the institution. I think institutions that have something close to 100% housing, for example, are reacting differently to this question than some schools that has maybe 15 or 20% in terms of housing. In terms of where the investment, I think in those cases, there's the latter case, there's more housing being built, and so it's not the same kind of issue there, and more the deferral exists in the academic side of the house. I suspect we would find, if we looked really closely at those institutions which are 100% residential, for example, that academic space is winning out over residential in the battle for dollars in deferral. The portfolio decisions have been made to say that we're going to push forward the academic rigor and quality of our programs, and we're going to take a chance on the housing. And so that's how that's being done. And I suspect, depending on the institution, the utility infrastructures are more reactive. They have to be attended to, because if you don't have the utility infrastructure in place, it fails, and it's catastrophic if people invest in it. But it tends to be reactive, because until it fails, most people don't notice it and don't see it. So it's a little mix of that across all three, depending on the institution itself.
Okay, thanks, guys. We'll do one more question. If we don't get to any questions right now, we'll definitely take note of everything, and we'll respond to you personally via email or phone call, if that would be preferable. But the last question that we'll answer on the call right now: has there been a trend to look into contracting, not just for building or renovations, but also including long-term O&M?
If there been a trend, there has long been dialogue about contracting operational services, and I think it's been back and forth. It's been mixed success. Some places it's been wildly successful, other places it hasn't. There have been a couple of recent notable large-scale efforts to outsource operational things, and I would say that the jury's still out on whether each of those has been a success or not. It takes a long time to see the impact of it, but I think it's a natural response to these issues of cost and increasing cost, and the challenges of creating greater efficiencies. And I don't suspect that that pressure is going to go away anytime soon, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's right or wrong. It simply means it's another choice the institutions likely are going to continue to consider when they are trying to reduce cost and improve service quality and efficiency along the way.
Okay. Thanks, Pete and Pete. It looks like we've addressed all the questions that we can while we're on the call. So I'd like to thank you all again for joining us today, and I hope that you enjoyed the session and found the information valuable as you continue to explore ways to create a new facilities conversation on your campus. So please don't hesitate to contact us via our website, sightlines.com, or directly at insights@sightlines.com if you have any additional questions following today's call or in the meantime. So thank you again, and I hope you all have a great day.